everybody. Uh, Good evening. My name is John LaFurla, and I have the great pleasure of welcoming you here this evening to this Brody Center Forum. This is going to be a tremendously educational event for me, and I'm sure for you as well. And I'm going to speak only for a minute because my job is to introduce the moderator, who then will introduce the speakers. But I get the pleasure by virtue of the fact that I am both a member of the League of Women Voters. Yes, as a man, men can be members of League of Women Voters. Yay! And I'm also a member of Common Cause. So I was nominated to give the welcome. This way it avoids who goes first problem. So I want to just say that the Common Cause, many of you know, started roughly 40 years ago. It's a national organization that has about 400,000 members across the United States. And Common Cause of Maryland is looking for more members. So please get some information about it or go online and think about becoming a member of Common Cause. They advocate for good government. They're a nonpartisan organization, as I'm sure you know. We're also sponsored tonight by the National Council of Jewish Women, the Annapolis section, and I want to recognize them. And also, of course, the League of Women Voters, which started in 1920, so it's been around a long time since suffrage, since the women got to vote. This is an organization that in which men and women together can work toward nonpartisan civic engagement. And there is information and membership forms for you to fill out and send in your check, of course. No, it's a great group. I also want to recognize Maryland Reporter, which is the media sponsor for tonight's event. So if anybody's here from Maryland Reporter, here he is, right here. Thank you very much. The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation provided the seed for these series of social science events. And this started nearly 20 years ago. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce our moderator this evening, Doug
Besharov, that's okay.
Besharov, thank you, who is a professor at the School of Social Policy. He does research on program evaluation and anti-poverty programs. And Doug has been the moderator, believe it or not, of all of the Brody Forum events going back nearly 20 years. So without further ado, I give you Doug Besharov.
John, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to welcome you here on behalf of the University of Maryland School of Public Policy. This is our business school. It's a slightly nicer ambiance, but we're attached right around the edge there. Some of you have been here. Hold it up. Is that a little better? Okay, good. And also, I want to welcome you on behalf of the Norman and Florence Brody Foundation and the forum that we operate. Unfortunately, Florence Brody couldn't be here tonight, but her son Bill Brody is here. Bill, give a shake. John already introduced the three co-sponsors to our group, to our meeting, the League of Women Voters, Nancy Sarang and John. Thank you very much. Nancy, give a wave. Common Cause. Now, I don't know whether Jennifer's here. Is Jennifer? Okay. And Tom Ferraro and Dan, who's up and going to speak, Vicuna, and the National Council of Jewish Women. If you don't have to be a man, hi. If you don't have to be a man to be in the League of Women Voters, do you have to be Jewish? You do not. You see, I don't like to say it, but what's this world coming to? For those, we saw a play last night called Bad Jews. It's really quite interesting. You might want. Did you see it? Oh, hold it up. Jeez Louise. It's a good thing I'm not going to be on this program. All right. John already said thank you to the Maryland Reporter. Thank you again. Well, redistricting, sometimes called gerrymandering, because an early example of a results-driven district was drawn to look like a salamander. And the person who designed it was a guy named Elbridge Gerry. And vice president, yeah. And so it is not surprising that this has a long and venerable history of politicians choosing their voters instead of the voters choosing their politicians. And I'm glad I got to say that before Congressman Delaney was here. Delegate Braveboy, it's okay because the The districts for the delegates are a little different. All right. We have 3 speakers, and I'll introduce them as they're about to speak. They each have about 12, 15 minutes max, and the reason for that is so that we have plenty of time for questions at the end. Delegate Braveboy is a lawyer, 13 years experience practicing. She started at the Federal Communications Commission. She worked at Prince George's County government, and she was first elected to the legislature in 2006. Congratulations for last Tuesday. She ran for Attorney General, was the first African-American woman to run, and was actually part of a debate in this building on the Democratic primary. She chairs the Consumer Protection Subcommittee, and I was impressed to find out that she had, over the last 3 years, introduced various bills designed to improve Maryland's districting process. And she'll describe the current redistricting process in the state, highlight some of its deficiencies, and talk about some of the court cases related to redistricting. Delegate Braveboy, welcome back. She is, by the way, an alum of the University of Maryland, so we are delighted on many levels. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Well, it's such an honor and a privilege to be at my alma mater. I always love coming back here, and every time I come back, I see a new building pop up, so it's, you know, a little harder to navigate since I don't come up here every day. But I'm so happy that so many citizens are involved and concerned about their basic fundamental constitutional rights. You know, it's one thing to exercise the right to vote. It's another thing to proactively defend your democracy. And I think that's what you're doing here tonight, is defending your democracy and understanding that it's not just about voting, but it's also being a part of the process that develops who you can vote for and who the citizens of the state will be voting for, and what communities get to stay together and what interests get to stay together. So redistricting is a very important issue. Common Cause, League of Women Voters, and other organizations have been working on this throughout the years, and I'm happy to join in the fight and in the struggle. I want to talk a little bit about the redistricting effort or the redistricting process in Maryland, and there's a really good PowerPoint that the government, the state has come up with, I think, just to kind of run through some of the areas that we'll highlight, and I'll ad-lib a little bit and tell you where some of the deficiencies are as we go through it. So why do we redistrict? To ensure that every person's vote is worth the same as another, and to assure equal opportunity to elect representatives of individuals' choices. So every 10 years following the U.S. decennial census, we go through this redistricting process. So the census data must be delivered to the state by April 1st. Well, at that last redistricting, it was April 1st, 2011. The next one will most likely be April 1st, 2021. And then the plans are developed, or were developed, in 2011. The General Assembly considers the legislative redistricting plan for the legislative districts in the 2012 session. So it's the session following the time that the census data is given to the state. So we can flip that. Okay. And so reapportionment, which we really didn't have to do here in Maryland because our population did not grow as rapidly or as much as other jurisdictions, we could have either won or lost a seat depending on whether or not we needed how our population grew. But we sort of retained the 8 congressional seats that we currently have. And of course, we were doing redistricting. Okay, so we have 47 legislative districts, as you all probably know, and those are the there's actually 47 Senate districts. Now, when it comes to the House districts, we have some of our districts are sub-districts, which are 1 or 2 member districts. And so in Maryland, typically most Senate districts have a three-member at-large House districts. But there are certain districts, and I can tell you there's a couple in Prince George's County, actually. District 47 has a District 47 A and B. District 23 has District 23 A and B. And actually now District 27 has A, B, and C. A and B both cross over into Prince George's County, and C is in Calvert County. But throughout the state, you'll see some sub-districts within those Senate districts. Let's see if there's anything else I want there. No, we can, oh, yeah. So for legislative districts, per our Constitution, and I'll read you the language from our Constitution, says that the state shall be divided into legislative districts for the election of members of the Senate and the House of Delegates. And the districts shall consist of adjoining territory, be compact in form, and of substantially equal population. And due regard shall be given to natural boundaries and boundaries of political subdivisions. That language is there for our legislative districts, that compactness, the due regard to jurisdictional boundaries. But we don't see that language. We actually don't see really any language with respect to our congressional districts. And I know that's going to be a source of a lot of conversation tonight. So, but I did want to run through that. So I think we can flip. Why do we do it? Well, the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, the Voting Rights Act, requires us to do fair redistricting. And of course, there's case law, which we'll discuss this evening also, that requires us to do fair redistricting. So Maryland Constitution, as I mentioned, is silent when it comes to congressional redistricting. So the federal requirements control. And so essentially what the federal law says is that every district should be the exact same size. Now, practically, that's not going to happen. So there's some deviation, but we can't allow for a lot of deviation. So we try to have the districts within a percentage of each other so that we're not violating the Voting Rights Act, we're not violating the Constitution or case law. So you can flip through that. And so this was the timeline for redistricting. At the time, the governor said that he would appoint his redistricting panel on April 1st, 2011. Well, we know that didn't happen. The redistricting panel was not established until July 4th of 2011. So there was a serious breakdown because we understood that that was not going to provide the appropriate amount of time for the transparency, for the input from the public, but that's what happened. So they told us initially that they think they're going to have a panel established on April 1st, but it didn't come until July. So in May, excuse me, I'm sorry, I take that back. That was, the data was received. May 2011, they were supposed to appoint the panel, but that didn't happen until July. I apologize. And so the public hearings actually didn't happen in May and June. It happened after the panel was established, which was, I think they started happening in like September, October. And we had to go back into session to do the congressional map in October. So it really didn't leave a lot of time for the input from the public that we should have had. And so this was their proposed timeline. Really, we didn't do a good job, or the governor didn't do a good job sticking to that. If you can flip it. And so with the congressional redistricting, we ended up going into a special session in I think it was October to redraw the congressional lines. It required us to pass a bill. So the House and the Senate had to vote on a bill, and the governor proposed a plan for the congressional maps that were not accepted by all, but by most, obviously the majority. And so those passed in a special session. And unfortunately, what that did for our state is it left us in a horrible predicament where we had some of the most gerrymandered districts in the country. And in fact, I'll read you a statement from a case that was filed against the state of Maryland. Now, Maryland was able to win all of the redistricting lawsuits this year, or back in 2011 that was filed against it. But I can tell you that Judge Titus, in his concurring opinion, did point out something very interesting, and I want to read the language to you. It said, "It is clear that the plan adopted by the General Assembly of Maryland is by any reasonable standard a blatant political gerrymander." Now, what happened was the plaintiffs in that case did not pursue the claim in a way that the judge could find, or the court could find in their favor. So it wasn't that the issue, the underlying issue, wasn't there. There was an obvious political gerrymander. But unfortunately, or fortunately, as a lawyer, I'm always saying fortunately, I mean, we do have standards set up in our court, and we do have, case law, and we try to ensure that there's some uniformity in decisions that are being made. And the plaintiffs in this instance did not present a case that the judges could find in their favor. But that doesn't mean we did the right thing, and it doesn't mean that if this occurs again, that we cannot take this matter up again in court. But it just meant that in this instance, that didn't happen. And so we passed the bill. We have these ridiculous districts. In particular, I want to point out that Congressional District 3 is particularly offensive for several different reasons. It probably defies most logic in terms of how it's drawn. It certainly divides communities of interest, and it egregiously goes into Montgomery County. So the district's actually based in Baltimore and in the Baltimore region, but because the party decided that they wanted to shore up the 3rd congressional district so that there was, no opportunity for fair competition there, they decided to grab Democratic votes in Montgomery County. They grabbed safe Democratic votes, and the reason why I say that is because they picked up minorities, specifically in Montgomery County, in order to make a Baltimore-based district a safe district. And on so many different levels, I find that offensive. If I'm in Baltimore, I find that offensive. If I'm in Montgomery County, I find that offensive. If I'm white, I find that offensive. If I'm black, I find that offensive. It is one of the just most blatant disrespect for not just race, but also for geographical boundaries, for communities of interest. And it was all to preserve an individual who had been in Congress for so many years that he would have been successful anyway. And then we'll talk about some of the other blatant sort of gerrymandering that occurred during this redistricting process. But I look forward to answering the questions that you might have, and thanks so much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Delegate Braveboy. So I'm delighted to introduce Dan Vicuna, and Dan has red-eyed it to be here. So if you fall asleep in his talk, we won't forgive you. But if he falls asleep in his talk, we will forgive him. Dan's a native of Southern California and has a long history of work on progressive causes. Before joining Common Cause, he was a staff attorney for the Fair Elections Legal Network in Washington, where he worked on voting rights issues, and he was a coordinator of campus efforts to institutionalize reforms of voting for college students. He also worked at the Alliance for Justice, where he analyzed U.S. Supreme Court cases, and he's worked on congressional campaigns in New Hampshire, state legislative campaigns in California, and the League of Women Voters' Dirty Dozen congressional campaigns. I love it. Dan will discuss less partisan methods that are used by other states to reform redistricting, how those states managed to adopt those reforms and how those reforms are working. Dan, would you like to be up here?
I'll go here so I can take a look at
Okay. You take a mic.
Well, thanks so much for allowing me to participate in this. The Tame the Gerrymander Coalition has done some outstanding work, I think, addressing, kind of highlighting the problem of gerrymandering in Maryland. And now I think part of the goal of this gathering is to talk about what some of the solutions might be. So I guess we can start in. We're going to talk about a few different models for redistricting reform. One is going to be the independent commission model. California has kind of the most independent system in the country, but there are other variations on that, so we're going to take a look at those. We're going to talk about states like Florida, in which the legislature still draws the lines, but they are restricted in their ability to gerrymander by constitutional requirements. A bipartisan politician commission is also a possibility, and we're going to look at very quickly at New Jersey, how that works. And then finally, Iowa has a unique model in the United States in that a nonpartisan legislative research entity does the drawing of lines, so we'll look at that a bit as well. So before we kind of dive into the models, I'm going to tell you just a few stories about what life was like in California before the Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission was implemented. Just one of my favorite kind of gerrymandering examples of California. You see here a fairly convoluted district here, this dark gray that goes around Hawthorne, Gardena, Compton, and then comes around to the Pacific coastline there. The reason it was drawn like this is the state legislator lived in Compton, but was a horse enthusiast. Unfortunately, his horses did not live in this section of the district, so we cut out, made sure he got a little sliver, a little road here to connect this bottom part so that he could represent his horses, an animal lover through and through. There you go. Also, what was going on in California, there was the brother of a sitting congressman was accepting $20,000 from Democratic congressmen to make sure their districts were made safe. A congressman, kind of said that this was a pretty cheap deal. I'll read the quote for those who can't read it. $20,000 is nothing to keep your seat. I spend $2 million campaigning every year. If my colleagues are smart, they'll pay their $20,000, and the consultant will draw the district they can win in. Those who have refused to pay, God help them. And finally, my boss, Kathy Fung, who runs our national redistricting efforts from California, was in the previous cycle working for an Asian American civil rights organization, and she went to talk to a state legislator in Sacramento about keeping together a Chinese American community in Sacramento, and the sitting legislator, fearful of a challenge from that community, said, "Kathy, you're not going to put one more fucking Asian in my district." Her words, not mine. So let me tell you a little bit about how the process in California works. It begins with applications from around the state. There was a rough estimate done by the coalition. Maybe there'll be academics, some community leaders. Maybe we'll get about 500 applicants. 30,000 people applied to the California Citizens Redistricting Commission. So a group of state auditors, nonpartisan, breaks that pool down. There are 20 Dems, 20 Republicans, and 20 individuals who don't belong to either party. The legislature, although it cannot appoint members to the commission, it can strike them. And we see that as a fairly reasonable opportunity to basically hire the legislature to do opposition research, to ferret out the partisan hacks. Finally, so 8 are randomly selected from that pool, and then those 8 select another 6. You end up with a commission of 5 Dems, 5 Republicans, and 4 who are neither. That last part where we have kind of a random selection, then another kind of choosing of individuals is a pretty useful way to make sure that the commission reflects the diversity of the state. I think building into any model, a commission or otherwise, ensuring that there's robust public participation. And California had public meetings, 100 all across the state, 32 cities. Obviously, it's a big place. Again, like the applicants, the coalition did a rough estimate of how many people might show up to testify, provide written comments. And they thought a few hundred, thousand. So 20,000 members submitted written comments, showed up at the public hearings, and make sure that their communities were protected. So there are also other independent commission models, independent in the sense that it's the commission and not the legislature that does the final line drawing. In Arizona, instead of just being able to strike, the legislative leaders choose from a pool of individuals. However, it is a pool selected by a nonpartisan entity. In other states, Alaska, Idaho, Montana, and Washington, legislators actually do the appointing. However, it has to be non-legislators who sit on the commission, and that's the last thing that they can do. Another model is Florida, where the legislature does do the drawing of the lines, but however, they are restricted in their ability to partisan gerrymander due to constitutional language, and that language is, no apportionment plan or district shall be drawn with the intent to favor or disfavor a political party or an incumbent. This is a bit of it's a complicated case. It's a cautionary tale. So the legislature sort of ignored that constitutional requirement because they hold on to that power fairly jealously. Common Cause, Legal Women Voters of Florida ended up suing on what were pretty gerrymandered congressional districts. On the left here, you see the 5th congressional district, which was designed really to tie together a lot of black communities to pack them into one district to make sure they had limited influence on surrounding districts. So the congressional maps, like I said, were overturned. And a lot of interesting facts came out about the degree to which the legislature was really committed to maintaining control of this process. It came out that they were having secret meetings, political consultants. There were emails that were deleted despite the fact litigation was imminent, or maybe because of the fact litigation was imminent. Political consultants for the majority party drew lines doing what they called an intellectual exercise, very thoughtful, creative academics. And finally, one of those maps, the intellectual exercise maps, was submitted under the name of Alex Posada, supposedly kind of Joe Q. Public, just demonstrating his interest in the process. However, when Alex Posada, a young Republican from Florida State University, was asked in court whether he submitted this map, he did not draw it, he did not submit it, he had no control over the email address, and to this day, we have no idea who actually submitted the GOP political consultants map. So again, cautionary tale, not written into these constitutional protections was some sort of mechanism for making sure that if the legislature did in fact violate the rules, that someone else would get to draw the map. So the judge overturned the districts, threw it right back to the legislature. So this was the original congressional 5th district, and on the right is what they redrew, and it ended up not being that great. Currently, Common Cause and League are appealing that remedy. So another option for reform is one that keeps legislators in the process. Maybe just more politically tenable to create a system in which politicians are involved. But instead of letting one party run roughshod over the other, we keep it equal. Both sides, in this case, get 5 appointees. A tiebreaker may be chosen by the state Supreme Court Chief Justice. Another word of caution, though, what you may find is that both sides decide to collude and just turn it into an incumbent protection program. So finally, we're going to look at the Iowa model, which is, like as I mentioned, unique in the country. The Iowa Legislative Services Agency is basically a research arm, nonpartisan, that does research on behalf of legislators, their staff. Since we're near Washington, some of you may have worked on the Hill or know about the Congressional Research Service. It's basically the equivalent. And it's actually been a fairly successful model, one that a lot of our states, Common Cause states around the country are pushing, where there's no ballot initiative option. The legislature actually has an option written into law to reject a map. They can strike down, up or down, 3 maps, and then just take it upon themselves to draw it. But in the 4 redistricting cycles since this was implemented, they haven't taken advantage of that power. All right. Let's skip for time reasons and this one. Okay. So just a little bit of the, there's a little bit of research on how a more independent process has gone so far. Some research has shown that there's increased voter confidence in states that have a more independent process. Voter turnout and knowledge are higher. And there are also a couple measures, partisan bias and electoral responsiveness, that go to the degree to which a state's votes translate into seats in the legislature. Those numbers are both, they're better for the voters in states with an independent process. So it's really positive effects, and a lot of good options for Maryland. Before I close out, I just wanted to make a plug. Common Cause is sponsoring the first annual Common Cause Democracy Prize, and this year's inaugural prize will go to the best, lawyer, social scientist, students to basically come up with a new standard defining partisan gerrymandering. Supreme Court has said that you can challenge partisan gerrymanders, but nobody's successfully done it, and we want to provide litigators with the tools to make that happen. So if you want more information, you can email me, contest@commoncause.org, on our website, commoncause.org/gerrymanderstandard. There's cash prizes and also publication in Election Law Journal, which is kind of the premier publication in this field. So we'd love to hear your ideas. So thank you.
Well, I've heard of great timing. Congressman Delaney just came in. So now we know why he's a successful businessman as well as a successful politician. Congressman Delaney was first elected to represent Maryland's 6th District in 2012. He won re-election last Tuesday, as well as Delegate Braveboy. And I think it was a little tighter than people expected, but congratulations. He is, I believe, from what I've read, the only former CEO of a publicly traded company presently serving in Congress, so that's also good. He has paid attention to the issue of gerrymandering. I'm going to read a sentence from the September 3rd op-ed that he wrote. Gerrymandering has turned the vast majority of House districts into one-party enclaves, whose representatives' main concern is making the most rabid faction of their parties happy, not finding a common ground to solve problems. Congressman Delaney, welcome. I'm told that he's going to discuss the problems in Congress, as I just mentioned, and the federal legislation that he is introducing on this subject. Congressman, would you like to be up here or there, whatever?
Wherever you would prefer me.
It doesn't matter, but here's a mic.
Great, thank you. So I really do apologize for being late this evening. The other area that I have a fair amount of focus on is infrastructure and transportation. I won't say that there's a problem with our transportation system. It's normal to take an hour and 40 minutes to go 9 miles. Yeah, absolutely. So anyway, but thank you for having me. Thank you for letting me join this panel of such terrific experts, and I appreciate the opportunity to share my thoughts with you. So let me start by talking about something that I've observed in my life to be very important, which is the power of incentives. And there's a quote that I will share from a gentleman that many of you may not have heard of, although he has a very famous partner. And the gentleman's name is Charlie Munger. And he has been Warren Buffett's business partner for about 55 years. And he wrote a terrific book that Warren Buffett has described as the best book that every American should read. It's called Poor Charlie's Almanac. And it's his sayings in life. And one of his sayings is about incentives. And he says that he's never met anyone in his whole life who appreciates and understands the power of incentives more than he does. And then he goes on to say, and yet every year he's underestimated them, and he's 90. And the point is that incentives really do matter in life. My career in the private sector prior to coming to the Congress really taught me about the power of incentives, making sure you get incentives right, because when you're leading an organization and you have multiple stakeholders, the customers, your shareholders, the employees, your community, I always had to make sure that my employees had incentives to care about all of those stakeholders, because if they only cared about one of those stakeholders, they would do things that would over time hurt the organization and its mission. So you really have to make sure you get incentives right when you think about any enterprise, any organization, et cetera. And the Congress of the United States right now has a very bad incentive system. And that's because of the gerrymandering process that's gone on in the redistricting. And in fact, about 80 to 85% of the districts in the United States are considered safe districts, which means there is no real challenge during a general election. So some estimates as much as 85%. This year is probably closer to 80%. My district is not one of those districts. When I won and had the privilege of serving my first time in office, many more Democrats voted in my election than Republicans. This past election cycle, 10% more Republicans voted than Democrats in my district. So my district is distinctly a purple district, which I think is great because even though it makes the general election process more difficult, it forces me as a member of Congress to really speak to my entire constituency. And I think that's a blessing. And if you think about stewardship, and we've been given a great privilege to serve in the Congress of the United States and represent 800,000 people, we should really talk to every single one of those people, no matter what their ideological perspectives. We should tell them what we're doing, and we should try to convince them that what we're doing is the right thing, and we should really listen to their perspectives, and it should inform what we do. And we don't have enough of that in the Congress of the United States. Right now, whether it's 80 or 85%, those individuals have an incentive. They may not do it, but if they follow their incentives, and we have to assume a vast majority of people will act to some degree on their incentives, their incentive is to only talk to half of the country. And in fact, because of the number of people who vote in primaries, which is embarrassingly low, their incentive, quite frankly, is to speak to the more active members of that half of the country, if you will, which is why we have such a polarized Congress, which is why the 500 people in the Congress of the United States behave dramatically differently than all the other human beings in the world. Because human beings have incentives to move forward and get things done and work with other people, because that's how you make progress in life. That's how you make progress raising your family. That's how you make progress with your own, whatever you want to do with your life. But the people in Congress don't have that. So I have a piece of legislation that I think can make a difference against that. It's called the Open Our Democracy Act. And it does three things, and I'll talk about them from kind of the least controversial to my mind to perhaps the most controversial. So the first thing it does that's not particularly controversial to my mind is it makes Election Day a federal holiday, which again I think is a pretty simple thing to do. People say, well, you'll lose a lot of productivity. I'm like, well, I'd love to have a debate measuring that lost productivity to the lost productivity with the kind of gridlock we have in Congress, right? And I, so I represent a district that starts in Montgomery County, goes all the way out to Western Maryland. I have a lot of people in Western Montgomery County and Frederick, Maryland, who I represent, who commute into Washington, D.C. to work, right? That's a tough commute, going back to transportation. They may allocate about 10 or 15 minutes in their day to vote, in the morning or the afternoon, depending upon their schedule. Stuff happens. Stuff happens with themselves, stuff happens with their children, stuff happens at work, stuff happens with the weather, stuff happens with the lines at the elections, which is ridiculous. That's a whole other discussion. And they can't vote. And if you think about the sacrifices people have made in this country for the right to vote, and how it is so singularly important to our democracy, we should do everything possible to make it easier for people to vote. And there's a whole portfolio of things we should do, but our bill deals with one of them, which is make Election Day a federal holiday. That doesn't mean everyone will have off, but let's face it, if it's a federal holiday, a lot more people will have off, or there'll be a lot more flexibility. That's the first thing. The second thing it does is it deals directly with the process of gerrymandering by creating national standards for how the redistricting process can be done in every state. And we actually commissioned the GAO to come up with these standards. And we believe the Congress of the United States, through the election clause of the Constitution, has the power, in fact, to direct the states and their legislatures how to establish these districts. Some people may disagree with that. It's our opinion, and we're sticking with it, that the federal government can actually do that. So it's fairly simple. It requires states to have independent commissions when establishing their districts. I think there's a fair amount of evidence, including in the biggest lab experiment of them all, which is the state of California, which implemented this process 2 years ago, that the California legislature, in fact, is getting more constructive. Now, it's a pretty low standard. Someone used to say to me, that's like jumping out of first floor windows. But there's a lot of evidence that it's working. It hasn't really changed the congressional districts all that much. There's a little bit of a tailwind there. But I really think it's important that we have independent standards and that the redistricting process is done on the level, which right now, quite frankly, it's not done on the level we know. Both parties are totally guilty of manipulating the system for their own benefit. And so that's the second thing it does. Again, that's controversial with some people, but again, I think that's clearly the high ground. I think in the fullness of time, people will look back and say, I can't believe they used to do it that way. One day we will do it right. And the third thing it does, which is probably the most controversial, but I also think is important, is it makes all primaries open primaries. Open primaries. So there's not a Democratic primary, there's not a Republican primary, there's one primary. And everyone runs in it, and everyone votes in it. And the top two vote getters go to this general election, right? and that general election occurs hopefully on a federal holiday. But you know, what I like about open primaries is it gives everyone a voice, including independents. One of the problems we have here in Maryland is independents can't vote in primaries. In 2000, 12% of the population in Maryland was independent. Today it's 20%. Independents are the fastest growing kind of political party in the United States of America. It makes sense. Each party feels, let me say it differently, the citizens feel very disconnected with these political parties. There's a strong libertarian streak going on in this country. We tend to think of it only as Republicans, right? But it's equally so with Democrats, right? They feel like, for whatever reason, and there's a whole long list of reasons, government is not serving their interests. Whether they feel like government is regulating them too much or taking too much of their tax dollars or fighting wars they shouldn't have fought or spying on them in ways they don't want to be spied on. Whatever it is, the people's opinion of government right now is really low. They view the parties as representative of that government, and therefore they're becoming independent. So, and these people, that, by the way, now can't vote in most primaries in this country. It's crazy. And so I also think open primaries will allow more people to have access. They'll allow for a more fulsome debate. As a practical matter, most of the general elections will be a Democrat and Republican based on the way the country is currently kind of allocated by party. But there will be some of these very gerrymandered districts that are very one-sided, right, that the people running will be forced to talk to all of the population. I think at the end of the day, what I'm trying to do is get the best representation possible for the citizens of this country. And the best representation is one that feels like they wake up every morning and report to every single person they represent, not just the people who happen to have a certain party affiliation next to their name. And I think that's really, really important, and that's why we think this legislation will make a difference. I think it's also incredibly important for solving the big problems and pursuing the big opportunities that are in front of this nation. Because to me, the right answer on so many areas of public policy is found by identifying the best ideas, no matter where they may reside. And there's so many solutions in this country and so many opportunities available to this country that could best be solved and pursued if you took the best ideas of the progressive movement and the best ideas of the conservative movement, right? Neither party has a monopoly on great ideas, right? And as Victor Hugo said, there's nothing more powerful in the world than a great idea. And each party happens to have some good ideas, to my mind. But right now, because of the gerrymandered system, because of the one-sidedness of so many of these districts, people feel like they're punished if they even acknowledge that the other side has a good idea. And I'll close with an example. I've got a really bipartisan infrastructure bill. I got 50 Democrats and 50 Republicans on it. Builds a lot of infrastructure, but it doesn't create new taxes to pay for it. We basically provide an incentive for private corporations to invest in it. This panel's not about my infrastructure bill, so I'll leave it at that. But it does have 50 Democrats and 50 Republicans. You know, when I'm trying to get members to join my bill, I'll go to people in very one-sided Democratic or Republican districts, and I'll say, what do you think of this idea? They're like, that's a really good idea. I'm like, would you like to join the bill? And they're like, if they're a Democrat in a really safe district, they'll be like, we have a lot of Republicans on that bill. I said, well, yeah, that's a bipartisan bill. And they'll be like, yeah, you know, that'll look bad for me in a primary. Same conversation with Republicans in one-sided districts. You want to get on this bill? I really like it, but you've got a lot of Democrats on that bill. I'll be accused of being, quote, in bed with Democrats in my primary. So that's, you know, in my own experience running for a district that was created as part of the last redistricting process in Maryland, which was probably not on the level. I know I'm going out on a limb. And hearing from my constituents and then me seeing it, you know, being animated in the Congress, working through legislation, has really made me passionate about this issue. So thank you for having me. I see my time is up, and God bless you.
Well, that was great. What a panel. Why don't we take questions from the audience? And John, do you want to hold the mic?
Thank you. I have a question for Representative Delaney. And my question is on co-sponsoring the John Tanner Fairness and Independence in Redistricting Act, which is H.R. 278. It's the John Tanner Fairness and Independence in Redistricting Act. And it's currently got bipartisan support. There's only about a dozen sponsors so far, but I'm wondering if you would commit today to co-sponsoring the John Tanner Fairness and Independence Act. And you know, the only other representative of Maryland that signed it is Van Hollen.
So is this on? It doesn't sound like it's on. So, look, I'm not going to commit to signing today because, the truth be told, I'm not completely up to speed with everything that's in it, and I don't commit to sign anything unless I've really read it and understand it. Is that the bill that creates kind of a multi-representative districts?
It establishes a system in all 50 states for independent redistricting commissions.
Got it. Well, that sounds like it's if that's what it sounds like, which is my bill, the Open Democracy Act, has 3 components to it. If it's substantially similar to my redistricting component, then I'm all in favor of it. But I can't honestly tell you here that I know everything that's in the bill, so it's hard for me to commit to be on it.
I'll give you some.
Yes, we can look it up. So, thanks.
Congressman Delaney, thank you for being here. My question to you is with respect.
Feel free if you wish to introduce yourself, but you don't have to.
With respect to your particular bill, how many co-sponsors do you have on that particular bill, and are they bipartisan, first of all? And second, with respect to point 3, with respect to your particular bill, you said that what it would do, it would create a situation where you don't have to necessarily identify the party with whom you are associated with. So if you hypothetically had 4 candidates running for that particular seat, the top 2 on election day would win, and then on election day would have a run
primary. Top 2 on primary day would win.
And then those 2 you would have a race between those 2.
They'd be a runoff, right?
So, but my question is going back to the primary itself. In today's situation, there are very few individuals that choose to come out on primary day itself, and that's when you actually notice with whom the individual party, with the party that they are associated with. If you take away the party affiliation of those specific individuals on a primary day, it would seem to me, and again, I don't have any basis for this, but it would seem to me that you would have even fewer individuals coming out on primary day. So, frankly, it might encourage even more of an extreme situation on both the left and the right.
Right. So there's not, the concern, I think there's 2 concerns you raised. The first is, will this system, these open primaries, result in even lower turnout during primaries? There's no data to support that. Where they've implemented these open primaries, they have not seen a reduction in participation. In fact, they've mostly seen an increase in participation. So I think that's the first thing, and I think it may create a little more excitement for the primary because there's a little more game theory going on in these open primaries that people have to be aware of, and so I just think it'll make it a little more interesting for people. As it relates to their affiliation, I tend to think, and again, all we can do is look at where this system exists, and it does exist. People will identify or self-identify what party they're in, right? Because that's really the only chance they have of they may self-identify as an independent, but they probably won't be able to get away with saying, I'm not going to tell you what I am, right? They'll have to say, I'm a Republican, I'm a Democrat, I'm a Green Party member, I'm a Libertarian, I'm an independent, whatever the long list of potential, Whigs, who knows what they'll come up with, right? So I think they'll self-identify. And I think there is not a lot of evidence to suggest that it will reduce turnout. But again, I tend to think of there's definitely reasons to object to all the things I laid out. Election day, a holiday, well, lost productivity. Gerrymandering, I mean, isn't this just for all states' rights? Things like these open primaries, what will that do? I think we should think about this as coming at this from a situation where there's almost 0 cost to experimenting, right? The system right now is so bad that the worst thing for us to do is to take a bit of a perfect is the enemy of the good approach to this, right? Because we really have a system that is performing, to say it at a suboptimal level I think is an understatement. So I think the data we have suggests that some of the things you're concerned about won't happen. But I also think we have to hold this to an appropriate standard, which is, if you look back over the history of this country, the problems we face as a nation right now, in my opinion, don't even compare to some of the problems we faced historically. And I think the facts favor that view. In other words, I think the facts favor the optimist. But where the pessimist can win the argument is they can rightly point out that government has never functioned to a lower standard. So while the opportunities may be greater and the problems may not be as significant, the ability of our nation to do what it needs to do to either pursue those opportunities or overcome the challenges may in fact be lower than it's ever been.
We actually have a little bit of experience here. Dan, of course, is from California, and California has a plan a little bit like that. Dan, do you want to talk a little bit about what the last 2 cycles have been like?
Well, in addition to California implementing an independent redistricting commission, it also simultaneously introduced an open primary. I mean, I think we're still looking at what. Oh, sorry. Okay. So, in addition to the independent commission, there's also a top 2 primary in California. It resulted in a number of incumbents either deciding not to run or being defeated more than the national average. And at least anecdotally, and again, I think there's more research to be done. There's evidence that Sacramento is a more effective place. I think California had a reputation for being somewhat ungovernable, going years without being able to pass a budget. The most recent budget was not only passed on time, but there was a budget surplus. So I think these kind of both redistricting and primary forms might work in tandem to make a more effective legislative body.
Christiana Logan-Smith, ignorant citizen. You mentioned in your speech, I know there were a number of court cases brought over the last Maryland redistricting, and you said that none of them was brought in such a form that the judges could find in their favor. Is that because of faults in the law, or just none of the litigants was clever enough?
Well, I think that perhaps their counsel did not research case law properly and bring the proper complaint. However, I do believe that our law, especially with respect to the congressional redistricting, the state standards, how we produce maps, because there are no standards, really it is very difficult to bring a claim against the congressional redistricting maps. So unlike in our Constitution, when it speaks to the compactness and due regard to political boundaries for state legislative districts, we don't have that type of language for congressional districts. And so the litigation, therefore, will be more narrow in terms of the claims that can be brought. And they're more difficult claims. Civil rights claims are extremely difficult. So if you're bringing a complaint stating that the map unfairly discriminates or undervalues or marginalizes a specific minority, in order to prove that, not only do you have to show that that there's a significant minority population, you have to suggest that there's a significant either African American or Hispanic or Asian population, and prove that these groups will tend to vote for a similar candidate. So it's really tough to prove those types of cases, and those cases that have been proven around the country have been very few. We've seen a couple in recent years, but very, very few. And so I think that to Congressman Delaney's point, if we did have, and I think we should adopt national standards in particular for our congressional representatives, because everything else is driven by federal law. So the way, the fact that to a person, essentially we can't do it to a person, but essentially to a person, the district should be similar or the exact same size. That is not a state law. That's driven by the federal law. So I think coming up with some standards really would help to bring some sanity to us as a state when we're drawing these lines, because again, they're operating at a whole different level. They're operating and having to produce national policy, foreign policy. We cannot continue to confine ourselves to like Republican, Democrat, and all that, when we have to really fight for America's stance in this world. And we're not able to do that if we're fighting each other over, well, you're a Democrat, you're a Republican, you're a Libertarian. It just doesn't work. And I think particularly at the congressional level, we need to have some type of uniformity.
Let me just make one more pitch for the writing. You want to help litigants out there create a new standard for gerrymandering. Again, commoncause.org/gerrymander standard. Give them some tools.
Yes, my question is also for Congressman Delaney. I'm interested in your open primary. Would you have any ability, or does it have any intention of preventing caucuses or conventions from deciding who the Democrats or the Republicans on that open primary would be? Or are they going to be subject to the potential of having 12 progressives divide up the progressive vote so badly that the Republicans who got together and figured out just to have 2 conservative nominees would dominate the thing?
There's no limitations, right? So it is an open primary, anyone can run, which is, I'm pretty sure, the way it's working in California, although I'm not an expert on California exactly how they do it. And so all the stuff you described could play out. So there'll be a whole new game theory that unfolds around these things. I think the parties will still play a role in discouraging and encouraging people to run. It'll probably evolve maybe a little more like, as you said, a kind of a convention system where they get behind one candidate more formally than others and things like that. And I understand that there may be some concerns with that, and I've heard concerns from people who feel very proprietary about their party, system and establishment, and they feel like this is a threat to that because it creates a little more of an open, free market on who can run and who can win. But I think that's the point at the end of the day. And again, as I said earlier, I don't think we can approach this with a view that everything has to be perfect. And some of the things you're highlighting are suboptimal outcomes, because it will be a little crazy in some of these situations in terms of the number, and you will get some weird outcomes. And if one party is particularly good at kind of controlling itself, you could see how it could use this situation to its advantage. But again, I think when you compare that to the situation we have today, which, I have great faith in the American people, and I believe things that don't make sense don't ultimately continue, which is what I think will happen with the system we have today. I'm not sure what the forcing function will be. It'll ultimately be the American people saying we've had enough of this. How that animates itself, I'm not sure. But I am sympathetic to the argument that when people say, hey, this current system we have right now threatens the republic, really, at some level. So even with those consequences that will be, unpleasant in certain situations, I think I still think it's a much better system than we have today.
I'm trying to call on people basically when I see their hand go up, but I'm not perfect about that. But go ahead, sir.
Thank you. A short comment and a question. My name is Bob Leventhal. Congressman Delaney, when you were first elected to Congress, I must admit that I was a bit disappointed, the reason for which was that your district was gerrymandered. But since you have become, I'm not a constituent of yours, so don't be concerned.
Although it sounds like it's turning now.
Yeah. But since your election, I just want you to know, as an individual, I'm really very proud of your record of accomplishment. You've made a number of important initiatives and a great contribution, I believe. So thank you very much. Wait, I have a question.
I think you're ending in a nice high point.
No, seriously, I do have a question. My recollection was that in 2012, there was a ballot initiative asking the voters of,
Yeah.
am I right?
Yes, absolutely.
About a referendum. Okay. Asking voters to approve or disapprove this crummy system. And unfortunately, because of the way it was worded, I think, they voted to keep this horrible system. Anybody want to comment on that?
Let me just say, I was one of probably 3 or 4 Democrats who voted against the congressional redistricting map. Okay. Now, I, for one, was thrilled when Congressman Delaney won because I didn't know him. In fact, I'd never spoken with him, but I was thrilled because what I understood was that those who drew the map did not have Congressman Delaney in mind. I mean, this map was not only drawn to increase the chances of electing a Democrat, it was drawn to increase the chances of electing a certain Democrat. And I think that was outrageous and egregious. And so I think what we have is someone who is independent, who's thoughtful, and because he represents people of varying viewpoints, I think he is the type of leader that will bring this country together. So I'm excited about that. But the process itself is still broken. The only thing that was on the ballot is whether or not to support the map. And the map is a bill. And because it's a bill, a legislative initiative, a bill, and that's really important because I have to talk about the state legislative redistricting process. We can always, or the citizens in the state can always petition a bill to referendum. But I think the language, as you pointed out, was confusing. Even my mother called me and said, can I vote against this? Because it says it's the constitutional requirement, and I'm like, Mom, vote against it. But I understand and I agree with you, and I think that Common Cause and others, I mean, doing this type of voter outreach and citizen outreach is so critical because the next time we do redistricting, hopefully we get it right. But if we don't get it right, I think we'll have a much more involved citizenry in the process, and hopefully we can strike down maps that are not. But the legislative process we have to fix in Maryland. Let me tell you, not only do we need to establish standards, whether it's now at the national level or push for standards at the state level with respect to how the congressional districts are configured, but the governor in Maryland is one of the most powerful governors in the country because when it comes to drawing the state legislative lines, our Constitution allows the governor to present a plan. Now, remember, he selects the Redistricting Commission. They propose a plan to him. His Redistricting Commission, I say his or hers if it's a female governor, it's really their commission, and they stack the deck to make sure that their outcomes are realized. And so when that plan is presented on the first day of the General Assembly in the year after the numbers are given, if the legislature does not act within 45 days, if the legislature does not act, guess what happens? That plan becomes effective, and that is the law of the land. But it is not a bill. Okay? And so the citizens cannot petition it to referendum. So that's a huge, huge problem that we have in our process. And so that's something that we have to work on. I've sponsored, and I know that many of you have come down to testify on a bill just to simply say, look, let's just have a commission to study the redistricting process. Do you know it doesn't get a vote in the House? Because I think that there is a willingness for people in the legislature to at least look at it. Let's at least study it. Let's at least see what else is out there. But it never has gotten a vote in the House. Well, because I had the votes in the House, but unfortunately, the process that those who are in control of the process can control whether or not a bill actually will come out of a committee and be presented on the floor. But this is why we're here to take back our democracy, to be active, to be engaged, and I'm so proud to be on the panel with these gentlemen. So,
Question over there.
Yes, I wish to question the consideration of congressional districts 3 and 6. I think it's been straightened out a little bit. But this card, for instance, they all have.
Sorry, we were trying to get the map up so we could show.
It's all, this card that we have refers to Congressional District 3 for gerrymandering. John Sarbanes was the congressman. John Sarbanes is still the congressman. He was not benefited by redrawing this awfully shaped Congressional District 3. But John Sarbanes' District 3 was not involved in gerrymandering, in my opinion. I question that. It was District 6. The governor and General Assembly definitely did a grand job of gerrymandering in District 6. And we have 7 Democratic congressmen rather than 6. And I think this ought to be very clearly delineated. It was District 6 and not District 3 that was gerrymandered.
I think when they, I think when they gerrymander, since it's a map and it's all interrelated, it all kind of goes together, in my opinion. Because one of the congressional district, the 3rd congressional district has been voted the most gerrymandered district in the United States of America. And right. If you look at them, if you were to apply the kind of independent standards that people would apply to coming up with districts, it fails the test more severely than any other district does. Just if you look at how that looks, do you have the map there? Yeah.
But it
Yeah.
wasn't gerrymandered. It wasn't, the lines weren't changed for political advantage.
That-
And that's the definition.
Yeah. Now, the one thing that's worth commenting on, and then while we're getting this thing up, no matter, even with independent commissions, people will still be very upset about the redistricting process, right? There's a baseline level of disappointment people have. Like I often hear this from my constituents, because I represent Western Maryland, and I represent Western Montgomery County. And actually, if you go back in time, the 6th district is more consistent with the way it was back for most of Maryland's history. It's kind of the Potomac River district there, if you see it in the brown on the far left. It actually, relative to some of the other districts, it doesn't look quite as contorted. But, you know, like my constituents in Garrett, Allegheny, and Washington County really want to be their own district. But the problem is there's not enough people there to make them their own district, right? And so they have to be, and I say this to them and then I duck because they throw things at me. But they have to be attached to something, right? But still it wouldn't be large enough, right? This still has to be attached to other things. And that's where you know, and if you go to people in Garrett and Allegheny, they don't necessarily think Frederick is Western Maryland. So my point is, and I'm not drawing any judgments here. The point I wanted to make is there's a baseline level of disappointment people have about the redistricting process, even if it's done totally on the level, which we have to remember as we talk about this. People are, you know, a good percentage of people are never happy with a bunch of this stuff.
In the back there.
I want to, if I could, turn to some of the examples of where you've had success with changing the process. Whatever the merits of your proposal, and I'm actually in favor of all 3 of those things there, I think you'd probably concede that at the moment the likelihood of your bill passing in this Congress is probably slim to slim. And therefore, if we're not going to have federal reform, it means changing the process at the state level. Unfortunately, there, it's something like partisan unilateral disarmament. Yes. Why would a blue General Assembly suddenly go behave a different way? Why would Texas decide that they're going to give up red seats by doing this? So you had an example, if I was counting right, 7 states that have done things, and you had 1 very large blue state, and you had 1 very large red state. So can you talk about how that change has occurred, and what can folks in Maryland do to bring about change here?
Well, some of the examples, you know, will simply don't apply in Maryland. You know, like Arizona, California are ballot initiative states. But in other places, there was sufficient public pressure, like Washington State is one in which it was the legislature that implemented a change. In Iowa, the legislature decided that they didn't want to do solely be the line drawers. And, you know, I think One, there's public pressure because it's, you know, they're ugly districts that demonstrate a desire to protect incumbents, to protect party advantage. And, you know, and I'd actually ask the delegate to speak to this. I don't know that drawing lines is a particularly pleasant process. It seems to be a vitriolic, angry process that leaves people not very pleased with each other. So I think, but in the end, it's these gatherings to make sure that, you know, a topic that is somewhat arcane to many in a state, to make sure that they are aware that this really cuts at our fundamental rights to fair representation.
I mean, anything but what we have now, because right now what happens essentially is that everything's controlled essentially by the Speaker of the House. And the Speaker will appoint his top lieutenants to speak to legislators and ask them, you know, how they'd like to have their districts drawn in the perfect world for them. And they give the Speaker, you know, their thoughts on what they'd like their district to look like. And if they believe that there's some competition, typically people are removed from districts. And that happens. It is what it is. So if there's a strong opponent in your district and you don't want to run against them the next time, guess what? Sometimes the line is drawn right in front of their homes. It is, yeah. In addition to that, well, I wanted to go back. Well, I wanted to look at the congressional district. I know a lot has been made of 3 and 6, but if you look at congressional district 4, that is particularly interesting, and you wonder why the Prince George's County is kind of broken up the way it is, because it seems to me that congressional district 4 could be a lot more compact. Well, it is because there's an interest to keep, you know, College Park and Greenbelt in certain areas in congressional district 5. It may not make a lot of sense to the average person looking at it, but there's personal interest from those who represent in these districts to keep certain facilities, institutions in their districts. But at the state level, this is what happens. So they tell the governor, well, I want to keep this in my district. I want to keep that. That's what happens. That's the real deal of what happens. So anything other than that would be really, really good for the state of Maryland.
I would like to.
Could I
ask
just
a
make
question.
one quick observation on that? So I think this issue is a perfect issue for a real big national movement. And maybe the best issue out there, right? There's a lot of things we all want to change in government, right? But a lot of them are really complicated, and a lot of them, quite frankly, are very ideological, and it's hard to get broad-based momentum. This issue is really about the people versus the government, right? Full stop. It's about the entrenched interest versus the interest of the common good of the United States, more than any issue, and I think it's a pretty clean cut. So I wrote I submitted 5 things to the Washington Post that got published as opinions in my first 2 years in Congress. I wrote a piece on this, the Open Democracy Act, when we filed it. And by a ratio of 20, 30 to 1, I received comments on it relative to the other stuff, right? And I thought the other stuff was really good, too, by the way. But this is what really resonates with people, this issue, you know. And so this can actually, I mean, California did it by ballot initiative. California's got a crazy ballot initiative process, but every once in a while something really good sneaks through. And that's what this was. But this can, you know, if enough, because to argue against some of this stuff is an utterly indefensible position. You cannot stand up in front of citizens and argue for not some reform here. You can't do it. You really can't do it, I think, and look halfway credible. So what the citizens have to do is push people. You really have to push people hard. And we have to figure out some way of mobilizing a movement here in Maryland and hopefully across the country. Because this is one where the people can really make a difference. Because unlike these other issues that, you know, yeah, we should do tax reform. But let's face it, there's 400 items of tax and there's 300 items of deduction. It's easier said than done. A lot of things are easier said than done. People can make arguments on both sides. This is a really clean case and a clean cut. And we just need more people to focus on it, and we can make a difference on this one.
So the question I want to ask one. And let's start with Dan, and as many people who want to answer this can. We have a new governor in this state, happens to be a Republican. We have a new governor in the state, happens to be a Republican. I don't have a mic. Happens to be a Republican. Putting aside the question of unilateral disarmament, putting that aside, because of course we're talking about Maryland because we're in Maryland. We could be in Texas or we could be somewhere else. What's the advice to a Republican governor whose interest, the incentive here, right, Congressman Delaney, the incentive is a different map for the Republicans. So how does he act to maximize the chances that we get what we've been talking about here, which is a fairer, more compact map? Dan first.
Well, there's a lot of public relations leverage. There's leverage of his veto pen, which, the substance of those issues I won't get involved in. But I mean, to really shine a spotlight, it's an incredible bully pulpit to use, to elevate the work, the kind of work that this Tame the Gerrymander coalition has been doing, to attend those events, to really demonstrate the absurdities of the system as it exists. I just think it's, as hard as we all have been working on this issue, to have that microphone is really useful.
I mean, the governor has the ability to actually issue an executive order establishing commissions in the state. So I think the first one he should establish is a commission to study redistricting, since clearly the legislature hasn't shown the desire to want to pass a bill establishing the commission, but establish a commission, make it bipartisan, invite groups like Common Cause, League of Women Voters, and others who have an interest to be a part of that commission, to at least look at how we do the redistricting process here in Maryland, get public input, hold forums in the community, and then perhaps propose some changes in the next legislative session following the work of the commission, so that we can have some real reform here in the state.
So I used to be a trial lawyer, so let me ask the second question, Delegate Braveboy. Besides you, how many Democrats in the state legislature would support the governor if he did that?
Well, I think he has as I think you said, a bully pulpit, because right now this is, I mean, look at what happened in this last election. Now, I am a Democrat, and I looked at what happened not just in the governor's election, but also throughout the legislative districts. I mean, we lost some very key Democrats. I mean, the chair of the Appropriations Committee. I mean, these were some tough losses for the party. But I think what it also suggested is that we have not really paid attention to those who we are supposed to be governing. And they don't really care a whole lot about whether you're a Democrat or a Republican or independent or Green Party or this or that. They care about the issues that are affecting them, the pocketbook issues. And so when you have more sanity coming to a redistricting process, when you have people who are going to be more responsive to their districts, I think you end up having a stronger party. You end up having a stronger state. So I think that people in the Democratic Party right now understand that we've lost our way, and we have to get back to the business of actually representing the people's interests. So I think you will find now, more than you would have maybe a year or two ago, an interest in something like this.
Congressman Delaney, is the next op-ed Delaney Hogan?
You mean on this issue? Look, I agree with what the delegate said, which is this would be a great issue for him to take on, but whoever, I'd be saying the same thing no matter who was the governor of Maryland, sure. Right? They should take this issue on. And again, I think, as I said earlier, trying to protect the status quo is, in my view, an indefensible position. Arguing for some reform is unassailable, right? So I just think, clearly, as a matter of policy, it's an easy decision. But I also think it's pretty good politics if you actually want to show you're trying to represent everyone in the state.
One gentleman in red has been patient. He gets the last question.
Oh, boy.
You all get the last answers. Then we're going to do a wrap-up of the panel. So go ahead.
Brace yourself all. Congressman Delaney, I want to go back to your statement about you know, your open primary, I guess what they would call that a Cajun primary. As a individual that supports a minor political party movement, I would feel that my interests would not be considered, and that probably a better plan would be to go to what I call instant runoff voting, where you rank the candidates in order of preference. Just your thought. Delegate Braveboy, thank you for your opposition to this map. I think that what really needs to be done, and your comment would be, you can comment on this, would be to establish districts that reflect geographic integrity and relative cultural homogeneity. Congressman Delaney, you can go.
Thank you. So as
Are you sitting up here? What is this?
So as I said in my introductory statements, my bill has three components, and I would list them in order of least controversial. The first was Election Day being a holiday. The second was national standards for establishing congressional districts. And the third is the open primary. I think they're all important. There's different ways of doing the open primary. So, I'm open to consideration of all those. Again, I come at this from the perspective that there's very little downside to experimentation, right? We're not preserving much of value in the current system. So that's my view. And since this is the last question, I want to just thank you all for having me, and I want to thank you all for your important work. And I really appreciate being with the panelists here. And the fact that the great delegate to my left has the name Brave, or the word brave in her name, should not be unnoticed, because her leadership on this issue is really has been singular. And so we haven't collaborated enough on this. We should do more, and we'll use this. This will be another good thing to come from this panel. So thank you.
Thank you. And, I did run, as was mentioned, for Attorney General in this last election. And so I won't be returning to the legislature next year. However, these issues I will continue to work on, and I look forward to working on them like you, as citizens who are interested in protecting our democracy. But with respect to, what these maps should look like, I think you're absolutely right. And when it comes to the congressional districts, we don't have standards. I think if we can't get them on the national level, let's be a model for the nation and maybe work on something at the state level, because most of these districts, we could actually achieve the goals of the party, I guess. That means, expanding, as much influence as we can. As long as we're not worried about an individual, we can achieve that without drawing lines that look like this. And I think that's important. But the other part of that, you talked about the cultural sensitivity. Well, we have something called the Voting Rights Act. We have the Equal Protection Clause. And so we do have standards that we must meet when we are drawing lines to protect the voting interests of those who may be minority in the population. And I don't think we don't give enough regard to those interests. And so that has to be a part of the discussion for the next redistricting effort. But we're starting now. And I think if we start now, we work hard, we get a redistricting commission in place either by the legislature or by the governor, and we start developing those recommendations, I think by 2011, we should hopefully get it right. Or 21, sorry, that's right, 2021.
I'll just close by saying, I think, as the Congressman mentioned, the arguments in support of the status quo, allowing legislators to choose their voters instead of the other way around, are really destined for the dustbin of history. And I think if we keep doing this work, keep flashing a spotlight, making sure that the folks know that this really affects their fundamental rights of fair representation, I think we can get there, and I see that future. So thank you to all of you for your participation and being here.
And on behalf of the University of Maryland, the Brody Policy Forum, Let me say thank you first to the wonderful panel. Besides everything else, we ended on time. That's important. And I also want to thank the League of Women Voters, again, Common Cause of Maryland, and the National Council of Jewish Women for helping us put this panel on. And I am told that besides some leftover munchies, there's coffee and sweet cookies. So thank you.